Second question. Can morality be legislated by civil government? I guess it depends on what you mean by morality. There are a couple slightly different definitions to that word. There's a more shallow definition of morality that would have to do with good or bad behavior, and obviously you can make laws about that. But we could also be talking about a more comprehensive definition, a true biblical morality that is doing the right things for the right reasons, and that cannot be legislated by civil government. And so, for example, we have laws in this country against murder. If you kill someone and it's not in self-defense, you go to prison. But if the only reason that you don't commit murder is because you don't want to go to prison, I would not consider you a very moral person. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 21 and 22, "You have heard of it that it was said of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment.' But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment." And so the Pharisees, they followed the law, but they were not moral. And really that's the difference between the two definitions of morality we are talking about. We can be concerned with the letter of the law, like the Pharisees, and we can be outwardly moral in our actions, or we can go beyond the letter of the law and be righteous. You can legislate outward behavior, but you can't legislate righteousness. We've talked about Josiah, King Josiah's attempt to legislate righteousness in 2 Chronicles 34:33. Josiah removed all the abominations from all the country that belonged to the children of Israel, and he mandated that all who were present in Israel diligently serve the Lord their God. All his days they did not depart from following the Lord, the God of their fathers. But then evidently the people were only doing these things and going through these motions because they didn't want to face physical consequences. And so as soon as Josiah died, they go right back to their idolatry. And so they may have done the right things for a short amount of time, but they did them for the wrong reasons. And so they were not moral, they were not righteous, and their good behavior did not last. It's true that civil laws can limit bad behavior, and that is a good thing. If you want to call that morality, that's fine, but it is not righteousness. In Romans chapter 13, in verses 3 through 4, it says that rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. And so Paul says that at least one of the reasons for the existence of civil government is to punish bad behavior. And so, civil laws can control moral actions. Governments can encourage good behavior through benefits. They can discourage bad behavior by force. But that doesn't really solve any of the real problems that we have in this world. It only treats symptoms of those problems. Let's use the example of gun control. I think that we can all agree that shooting people is generally an immoral practice. But in the United Kingdom, they legislated extremely strict gun control. Did that solve the problem? In fact, stabbings and knife violence dramatically increased. And so they started legislation against owning swords and selling knives online. You think that's going to solve the problem? We can talk about whatever issue you like. We can talk about immigration, drugs, war, abortion, racism, school shootings. Laws may or may not help the symptoms of those problems, but what is more likely is that laws are just going to move those symptoms around to give the illusion of human success when the only one that can fix our sinful mess is God. We can make one thing illegal, which is, by the way, not a bad thing to do, but if we don't solve the problem, then a different symptom is just going to pop right back up. And the real problem is that we have a huge issue with a lack of respect for human life. Warren had a great lesson on the value of human life a while back, teaching people the truth about Genesis 1:26, that man is created in the image of God, that is the solution to the real problem behind abortion, behind racism, behind drug abuse, behind war, behind shootings, behind literally any other issue that we could name off. If you look with me in Matthew chapter 5, we're going to park here for a minute. Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 again. The law says, "You shall not murder." Is that a good law? I would say that's a good law. But the Pharisees were technically following that law, and it did not make them moral people. Because in verse 22 it says, "Whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of judgment." What about verse 27? The law said, "You shall not commit adultery." Is that a good law? I think that's a good law. But the Pharisees followed that law, and it did not solve the problems of their heart. Because in verse 28 it says, "Whoever looks at a woman to lust for her already has committed adultery in his heart." And so you see, you can mandate actions, but you cannot mandate what is in people's hearts. And as long as there is hate, and as long as there is lust, and as long as there is greed, you can make all the laws that you want to make, and there is still going to be immorality in any society. And that immorality is going to manifest itself in the abuse of people who are created in the image of God. And the only way to create a moral society is to turn people's hearts back to God. How do we do that? Can that happen? By voting the right people into office. It's interesting to think about how our system of government in America is so much different than literally everyone in history before us. For most of human history, most countries were under some form of monarchy, and they didn't really have a choice who their leaders were. And in most of those cultures, the monarch was usually seen as some sort of moral leader, maybe even a religious leader. And so the morality of the nation would typically follow the morality of the leader. But that's not really the way we do things here in America. Thankfully, most people do not follow our president to be their spiritual leader. Would not recommend that. And we actually do control, at least to some extent, who our president is. But what that does is that completely changes the way that change is affected in our culture. Our leaders do not control the culture nearly as much as our culture controls the leaders. They have to beg for our votes. And so their motivation is to become more like the voters rather than trying to make the voters become more like them. And that's why if you look at even the politicians with the most conservative values, they have become progressively more liberal as our culture has become progressively more liberal. Does politics affect the righteousness of a nation, or does the righteousness of a nation affect its politics? I think the Bible's pretty clear on that. And truly, even if our goal is to make this nation a more moral place, the place to start with that is not the ballot box, but it's with turning people's hearts back to God. In 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 14 is a verse that is often quoted by politicians in connection with politics. But it actually has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with turning back to God. It says, "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land." And of course, we know the context of this verse is in relation to the kingdom of Israel, and it's talking about God's judgment on them of drought, of famine, of pestilence. And God is saying if they repent and if they turn back of them, that kind of judgment will stop. But also notice who he is specifically talking about in that verse. He says, "My people who are called by my name," if they are doing what they are supposed to be doing, then there will be no need for chastisement. And that's what God is saying in that verse. If you want there to be less abortions in this country, I completely agree with you. If you want there to be less shootings and less homicides, I am with you. "Thou shalt not murder" is a great law. But the problem is not going to be solved unless people learn to respect that God has given the gift of life. Do you want there to be less divorce in this country? I really do. Should we make no-fault divorce illegal? I'm not opposed to that. But you're always going to have horrible marriage problems until you teach husbands that they are supposed to love their wives as their own bodies and as Christ loved the church, and that wives need to respect their husbands as the Lord. If you stay right there in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20, it says, "Unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." Laws that encourage good behavior and punish bad behavior, those are fine. Those are good. That is what God instituted civil government for. But as Christians, I hope we can see that the souls of our neighbors seeing the kingdom of heaven are much more important than the survival of another empire. Paul expressed in Romans chapter 10 and verse 3, he said that he wished that he could trade his own salvation for the salvation of his countrymen. But he knew that he could not legislate them there. That's what they were trying to do. The Pharisees upheld their definition of morality by their legal codes. But Paul knew that God's definition of morality went deeper than that, to righteousness. So if you want to save this nation, your time will be better spent evangelizing than trying to rally around a politician or get policies passed. And as the culture changes towards Christ, so will our leaders, and so will our nation's politics. But it cannot happen the other way around. I think that we have seen that demonstrated in the Bible. To effect righteousness, we cannot look to the power of a man, but only to God. If you want to treat the symptoms of sin, that can be a good thing. That's all fine. But don't devote so much time and energy, and do not stake your reputation and your influence there to take away from the work that is actually going to effect lasting and meaningful change in turning people's hearts back to God. Remember the words of Proverbs 14 and verse 34, that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. You cannot legislate that, but we can all preach it, and that's what we should be doing.